Evening, everybody. Recording in progress. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our very first My Story event for this wonderful 2024-25 season. So glad to see all of you. And tonight we are so thrilled and honored to welcome the cellist Evan Drachman in a conversation with Dr. Eyal Bor. We're all going to enjoy that so much in just a moment. I just wanted to remind you that we do not have a Tuesday at the Flicks in October, nor do we have a First Wednesday concert in October because of the high holidays. But November, we're back in motion. And also love to welcome you Tuesday to All About Barbie's Mom, Ruth Handler, with Barbara Blumberg-Resson at 10:30 on Tuesday morning. And then 1 o'clock in the afternoon, come and join us for creating your own vision board to have memories and ideas about your goals and your aspirations and things of that nature. And then on Thursday, from Moses to Moses Maimonides, it's a history of rabbinic healers with wonderful Dr. Ellie Miller. He was with us last Thursday with a fabulous program. So you are welcome to join us. If you need a book, a brand new course guide with all of our programming, all of our events, all of our concerts, please be sure and let me know. I'll be happy to pass one on to you. And without further ado, it's my pleasure and again my honor to introduce you to Dr. Eyal Bor.
Thank you, Ellen. Good evening to you, ladies and gentlemen. The congregation, the membership has plethora of professions, doctors, lawyers, teachers, accountants, you name it. But here tonight, we have a very, very special artist, one of the best. And his name is Evan Drachman. We all know about him. Not only that we are very honored to have him, but his entire family are members of Beth El. Cellist Evan Drachman, founder and artistic director of the Piatigorsky Foundation, has combined musical talent with artistic vision to create a rich and varied career. Mr. Drachman spends much of his time performing recitals, concertos, and chamber music in the United States and abroad. As artistic director of the Piatigorsky Foundation, he has become one of this country's most respected authorities on the presentation of live classical music to diverse audience. The foundation's mission is to make live classical music a part of the fabric of everyday life of underserved communities throughout the United States. The organization is named after Drachman's grandfather, cellist Gregor Piatigorsky. Mr. Drachman received his BMA from the Curtis Institute of Music in 1988. His teachers have included Luis Garcia Renard, Orlando Cole, Lawrence Lesser, William Plith, and Stephen Katz. In 1994, Mr. Drachman performed with the Odessa Philharmonic in Odessa and Kiev. In 1997, at the invitation of Mstislav Rostropovich, Drachman traveled to Russia to perform as a soloist with the St. Petersburg Symphony under Maestro Rostropovich. In 1999, Drachman recorded his first CD with pianist Richard Dowling. The Baltimore Sun's Stephen Wigler wrote of the recording, Drachman possesses in abundance two qualities for which his grandfather was revered: the ability to make the cello imitate the human singing voice, and even more important, the ability to tell a story. Following this success, Drachman and Dowling released two more recordings titles, Infinity in 2004 and Raman's Revelation in 2007. In 2012, Evan Drachman released Full Circle with pianist Victor Santiago. Their latest recording, Fantasy, was released in 2018. This season, Drachman will be performing works by Beethoven, Brahms, Bruch, Dvorak, Saint-Saëns, and Tchaikovsky. His travel schedule will include tours of Massachusetts, Vermont, Washington, Oklahoma, Florida, and California. Evan Drachman currently lives in Maryland with his wife, Joan, and their two sons, Ellie and Oliver. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to ask Evan a few questions. And if you have any interest in knowing better Evan or his work, can you put him on the chat? And our producer tonight, Rebecca Waltmeyer, will read the question at the end of the presentation. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Evan, for being here tonight. And without further ado, let's start the questions. Can you please, Evan, share with us your upbringing, high school, college, graduate school?
Sure. I mean, first of all, good evening, everyone. Eyal, it's really nice to be here with you and Ellen and Becca and Rosalind and hi. Let's see, my upbringing. I was born in Boston, and when I was 6 years old, my father was asked to start the neurology department with a couple of colleagues at Johns Hopkins. They didn't have a neurology department up to that point. And so he was very excited at this prospect and moved the entire family to Baltimore. So I was 6 years old. So really, I grew up in Baltimore. And I started out in Baltimore going to the Friends School. Then in second grade, I switched to McDonough School. And when I really started to take the cello seriously, and it was what I really passionately wanted to do, I discovered that McDonough was not set up at that time to support someone who wanted to be in the arts. And so I switched to the Park School, and they were wonderful. I went to high school from 9th through 12th grade at Park School. When I graduated from high school, I moved to London, England for 1 year. I studied with a wonderful cello teacher there named William Pleath. William Pleath was the teacher of a very famous woman cellist, Jacqueline Dupre. I even got to take a few lessons with her while I was living in London. After that year in London, I moved back to Boston, and I went to the New England Conservatory of Music for 2.5 years and then transferred to the Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia. And that's where I got my bachelor degree from the Curtis Institute of Music. Since then, I've played concerts all over the United States, Canada, Great Britain, Sweden, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Macau, India, Russia, Ukraine, Singapore, Malaysia, maybe a couple other places I can't remember. But really, a lot of the work that I've done since graduating in 1988 has been through the Piatigorsky Foundation and its mission to bring live classical music to people who otherwise might not get to hear it.
That's great. So how old were you when you started the cello? And maybe I can ask you, why cello?
Well, I don't know if everyone could see, there was a photograph I sent this morning of me when I was very young with a cello. I think I was 3 years old. Now that was optimistic to think that I would start the cello at age 3. In fact, there weren't strings to fit that cello. You had to take full-size strings and cut them down, and they wouldn't tune very well. And then I wasn't able to find a cello teacher at that time, and so there was a violist who pretended to play the cello by putting her viola in between her legs, and I wasn't having it. So it didn't last. At age 3, I did not continue the cello. A little while later, I studied the piano, I studied the guitar, I studied the drums. I played all kinds of different instruments. And when I was 11 years old, I told my parents that I had decided I really wanted to play the cello. Well, they said, sure you do. After all those lessons of the piano and the guitar and the drums and everything else, they said, why don't you get straight A's for a semester and then we'll see. So I did. I got straight A's for a semester and I got a cello. And now, so this is sort of an interesting thing. Here I was 11. It was 1975. And my grandfather found a cello for me. My grandfather was Gregor Piatigorsky, a great Russian cellist. And one of his wonderful students, Nathaniel Rosen, started with him when he was 13 years old and had played a 7/8 size cello. And so my grandfather thought that would be the perfect instrument for my grandson. But of course, Nathaniel Rosen had sold it long before. So my grandfather tracked down that cello. He found it, and he found the person who owned it and bought it from them. And he sent it to me, and he sent it to me with a note. Well, I haven't seen that note since I was 11 years old. But just a little less than 2 years ago, my father passed away, and my mother passed away in 2019. And so we're going through the entire house and emptying it, and I found the letter. I found the letter that my grandfather sent me with that very first cello. And I was such a happy thing to see that letter again. It said, "I wish the two of you a happy life together." So there I had my 7/8 size cello. Now, when you start a string instrument, there is a very steep learning curve. It is hard just to make one nice sound on a cello or a violin or a viola. And I struggled. I had lessons, I had a teacher, but you sit alone in your practice room and you squeak and you squawk and you play out of tune. And I wasn't practicing very much. I would go to my lessons, I'd practice a little bit in between, and my parents were getting frustrated. Here I was, another instrument, and was it going to stick? So they decided that they thought it might be a good idea for me to go to a summer music camp. They found out about a camp in Lenox, Massachusetts, in the Berkshire Mountains called Marywood. Now they got a brochure and they gave it to me, and the brochure said that every single day you would play 1 hour with an orchestra, you'd play 1 hour with a string quartet, you'd have a private lesson, a 1 hour private lesson every day, 1 hour of chorus rehearsal, and 1 hour of individual practice. So here I was looking at 5 hours of music a day. Now, before that, I had practiced maybe as much as 15 minutes a day, whether I needed it or not. So I was a little unsure that I was going to commit myself to this. But further in the brochure, I saw that it said that there were 3 girls to every boy. So I thought I might give it a try. So I went to this music camp. And the first time that I was able to sit in an orchestra and sit with a string quartet and play with a piano and actually create music, I was taken by it. I was just completely taken by it. And after that, it was all I wanted to do. When I got back from that camp, I would get up at 5 in the morning before school, and I would practice before school. Then I brought my cello, and every free period I would practice. And when I got home, it was practice first and then do my homework. So my grandfather used to have a saying that once you've tasted the blood of music, there's no turning back. And that's really what happened to me. I mean, really, truly, from that moment, there has not been a moment in my life when I haven't wanted to play music and play the cello more than just about anything else.
Can you share with us a little bit about your father, Dr. Daniel Drachman, and about your mother, Japta? Can you tell us about them, please?
Well, my father, Daniel Drachman, grew up in Brooklyn. He was the son of an English teacher, high school English teacher, and so he taught English and was also a poet, Julian Drachman. His mother was a Hebrew school teacher, and Julian's father, Bernard Drachman, who in fact I'm sort of named after, my middle name, Evan Bernard Drachman, was a rabbi. And he was an Orthodox rabbi, and he founded the first Orthodox synagogue in Manhattan. It's called Park East Synagogue. So my father grew up Orthodox. My mother was the daughter of Gregor Piatigorsky, famous cellist, and her mother was French, Jacqueline. And so my mother was born in Paris. Her first language was French. And when Hitler invaded, they were luckily on the last boat that escaped France. It was really a pure fluke that they got out, because my grandmother was getting more and more concerned about Hitler. And one morning she woke up and she said, "We're leaving." So my grandfather said, "It's a good idea. We'll plan a trip." Well, she said, "No, we're leaving right now." So they packed suitcases and they bought tickets on a boat and they got on the boat, and the boat was ordered to stay because Hitler had just invaded. And so the boat stayed in anchor for 24 hours, and then the captain pulled anchor and left. And it was the last ship that got out of France.
Wow.
Now, they arrived in America, and many immigrants were being turned away. My grandfather, on a previous tour of America, had been touring around the Adirondacks, and one of his colleagues, another Russian musician, had pointed out a property in upstate New York and said, you must come and see this property. It has beautiful trees like your hometown in Ukraine. So, well, my grandfather looked at the property and admired the trees. He said, why are you showing me this property? He said, well, the bank is auctioning it off. Well, my grandfather lived in Paris. He had no reason to own property in America, but in a fit of nostalgia, he called up the bank and he offered a ridiculously small amount of money for the property. Well, sure enough, he got the property. So when that boat landed, he was a landowner. So he was allowed to get off the boat and come and live in America. He was a landowner. And I do have a photograph of him standing at the courthouse. It's Elizabethtown, New York, when he did become a US citizen. And he looks so proud. He was very, very happy to become a US citizen. Prior to that, he had defected from the Soviet Union. I mean, the revolution had already happened, so he had run away from the Soviet Union, and he hadn't been a citizen of any country for many, many years. He traveled on something called a Nansen passport. And my grandmother once showed this document to me. It was very, very long. It unfolded in many, many sheaths of paper. And my grandfather said the great advantage of having a Nansen passport is that you don't need a hotel reservation when you cross a border, because as soon as he would cross a border, he would be thrown into jail. And the first night he spent in prison. And by the next morning, the orchestra that had hired him as a soloist would come and bail him out of prison, and then he could play his concert. But it was very difficult for him traveling under that document. And so he was thrilled to become a US citizen.
Yeah. Father was also a musician, not just a doctor, right?
My father played the clarinet beautifully. He absolutely adored playing the clarinet. He practiced every single day. And when my father was engaged to my mother, my grandfather invited him out to California, to Los Angeles, and he told my father that he wanted my father to play with the boys. What that meant was that my father was to play the Mozart Clarinet Quintet with Gregor Piatigorsky. On the violin was Jascha Heifetz and Israel Baker, and William Primrose played the viola. They were the greatest musicians on the planet. And my father, who'd never played with anyone other than amateurs, was quite nervous. And so he practiced very hard and he arrived to play. And so my grandfather wanted him to play before he would announce the engagement. My grandfather said it was like the young buck had to kill the buffalo before the chief would announce his marriage to his daughter. So my father arrived and he pulled out his music and he handed it out to all these great musicians. Well, my father only owned one clarinet at that time. It was a B-flat clarinet. The Mozart Clarinet Quintet is written for an A clarinet. Well, all these parts were transposed for the B-flat clarinet. Now, none of those musicians had ever seen a part. They'd all knew the Mozart Clarinet Quintet, but in A, not in B-flat. And so, but of course, they were quite capable of playing it in a different key. Now, Jascha Heifetz wrote on my father's copy, he wrote after the engagement was announced, with all best, however transposed wishes. Jascha Heifetz.
As a clarinetist, I can tell you the transposition from a B-flat clarinet to an A clarinet is a major work. It's very cumbersome. It's very complicated.
Yes.
So anyhow, can you share with us how did your parents meet? Where?
So my parents met in Boston. My father was, I believe, doing his residency, his medical residency, and my mother was attending art school in Boston. Now, my mother tells this wonderful story. She went to a party, and she went with a date who she wasn't terribly fond of. But it was a party, and so she went to the party. And at this party, she met, my mother was very tall. She was almost 6 feet tall. She met another very tall woman, and the two of them hit it off, and they talked a lot. And after the party, they exchanged phone numbers. And about a month later, my mother receives a phone call from this tall woman she met at the party. And this tall woman, her name was Eleanor, she starts telling my mother about her new boyfriend and talking about her boyfriend, and he's tall and he's handsome and he's a doctor and he's so wonderful. And meanwhile, my mother is getting more and more disinterested in thinking, I don't need to hear about your boyfriend. And then she says, and he has an identical twin. So they went on a double date. And sure enough, my mother married Daniel, and his twin brother David married Eleanor. And so that is how they met.
That's interesting. It's a wonderful story. Your grandfather had very interesting instruments, cellos. Can you just share the story, how he got them, and what are those instruments?
Well, he was fortunate. I mean, he became one of the most famous cellists in the world. And so he was fortunate to play on some very, very fine instruments. When his career was just starting to take off, he was in his 30s and his early 30s, and he was playing on an instrument which was not a great instrument. It had a damage to it, and it was a very difficult instrument to play. And he performed a major concert in London, and backstage, he was talking about the cello and that it wasn't responding. And there was a wealthy American who overheard him. And this wealthy American said to my grandfather, said, do you know the great dealer in London, W.E. Hill and Sons? My grandfather said, yes, of course, I know him. So this American said, would you take me tomorrow? I'd like to go together with you to this instrument dealer. So the two of them went, and they arrived at W.E. Hill and Sons, and they had just gotten in a fabulous instrument made by a man named Dominicus Montagnana. Now, this is a cello that hadn't been played in over 100 years. And my grandfather saw it and was captivated by it. It was gorgeous, but it was asleep. And so he started to play it, and he was trying to coax the voice out of this instrument. And he played and he played and he played, and suddenly he looked up and it was dark and they were closing the shop. And my grandfather said, where is this man I came with? He said, well, we're sorry, he had to catch his boat back to America. He has left. But before he left, he bought this cello for you. So here he had this gorgeous Montagnana cello, and he played on it for many years, and many of his great recordings are on that cello. But he always wanted a Stradivarius. And there aren't very many Stradivarius cellos, and there particularly aren't very many great Stradivarius cellos. And so all the dealers in the world knew that Piatigorsky was looking for his cello for a Stradivarius. And one day, a dealer in New York called him up and said, "I think I found your cello." And so my grandfather came to the shop, and there was the Bodio Stradivarius. And he played on it for 5 minutes, and it was love at first sight. And that was it. And he played on that cello for the rest of his life.
That cello, the Stradivarius?
Sorry, what was that?
When was it made?
It was made in 1725.
Wow. Do you have any memory of one of your grandfather's concerts? One memory. I know you have many, but can you share one?
So the truth is, unfortunately, I don't have many memories of his concerts because I was quite young when he passed away. In fact, I had just started the cello when he died. So I do have a interesting memory. I went to 2 concerts that he played. One of them was a chamber music concert with Jascha Heifetz and other musicians. And my brothers and I were very young. And at intermission, we decided we don't want to sit and listen to this music. We went into the parking lot and played football. I wish I could go back and listen to that concert. But there was another concert actually earlier than that. And my grandmother decided that she wanted me to hear the concert. And so she came and she picked me up in Boston, and we took the train together to New York. And we went to hear this concert. And I remember sitting rapt, listening to him playing. But I just had this very vague memory of it. Fast forward many, many years, and they're doing some kind of an event in Carnegie Hall, and they're honoring my grandfather. And I'm sitting in the audience, and they show a screen, a movie of my grandfather playing, and suddenly it rushed back to me. And I vividly remembered sitting in Carnegie Hall and hearing him play live. It was an amazing moment because before that it had been quite a vague memory. But that movie, seeing it in the same place that I heard him play, brought it all back to me. But I wish I could have heard him play more. I've watched plenty of movies of performances that he's given and listened to recordings, but not a lot of live performances.
That's interesting. And I just wonder, your grandfather played at Beth El, right? Can you tell us when and under what circumstance?
He did. So it was, let's see, 1975, I believe. And it was my older brother's bar mitzvah. And he wanted to play for the bar mitzvah because he had never been bar mitzvahed and he couldn't do an aliyah. And so he wanted to do something for the bar mitzvah. And so it had been decided he was going to play a piece. And so he improvised a piece and he called it Prayer. Now, years later, after he had died and I was playing the cello seriously, I came across a cassette tape of that bar mitzvah. And there was the piece. And I spent hours and hours transcribing it off the recording onto paper, and I learned it. And it's a piece that I have played very often. I played at both my sons' bar mitzvahs in Beth El, Oliver and Eli. And I don't know, maybe I can play a little bit of it for you now.
Go ahead.
Would this be a good time?
That would be a fantastic time. Yes.
Let's see.
Thank you.
Okay, now I've just turned my computer onto original sound. We'll see if that works or not, but let me get my cello.
It sounded so beautiful. Oh my goodness. It's so appropriate for the upcoming Slichot and the high holidays. Can you say a word about Slichot?
Slichot is a service that has become very meaningful for me. It must be probably close to, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago now, at least 15 years ago, that Cantor King composed a piece for cello, cantor, and male chorus. And we have been doing it every year for Slichot. And I look forward to it each year. It's about an hour long. It's the entire service. And it's a remarkable piece. Cantor King wrote, it's gorgeous. It incorporates all the melodies from the high holy days, plus some original music that he wrote. And it's just beautifully written. And for many, many years, every year we would tweak it. We would try a little something different in this part, or something a little different in that part. And each year I adjust it slightly one way or another, but I look forward to it. And he and I just had our first rehearsal, and we have another rehearsal tomorrow, and then we rehearse with the men's chorus on the 24th, I think. The Slichot is the 28th, I believe, at 9 o'clock at night. And it's in the Gorn Chapel. And it's one of my very favorite holidays because of
So,
this.
ladies and gentlemen, please put down September 28th at 9 p.m. at the Goran Chapel. Evan Drachman and Cantor King will be playing a piece that was written for this particular service. Can I ask you a few questions about your personal life? Not too personal, but some questions.
Yes.
How do you manage the week as far as practicing is concerned?
Well, practicing is not something that I feel that I have to do. It's something that I want to do every day. It's I'm not very happy when I don't get to play my cello. It's my voice. It's how I express myself. So I play every day. I practice every day. I would say most musicians practice a lot when they're at home, and when they're on the road, they're performing, they don't have the opportunity to practice. For me, it's a little bit the opposite, because when I'm at home, I have so many things to do. Things in the home, things with my children. There are just so many things to do that I do what I refer to as treading water, which is practice a couple hours a day to keep my fingers in shape, keep the repertoire in my fingers. And when I'm on the road, that's when I really get to play the cello a lot, because I'm just with my cello. I'm in the hotel room, so I rehearse, I practice, I perform, sometimes 2 and occasionally even up to 3 concerts in a day. So I come out of a tour feeling like I'm in my best shape ever, and then tread water until the next tour.
Are you touring? How many days a month are you out of the home?
Well, it varies. Like in many professions like this, it's feast or famine. So this summer I had mostly without touring. I had a few concerts here and there, but starting on Tuesday I leave, and then I have quite a few tours. So it roughly amounts to maybe 60, sometimes up to 70 concerts a year. So back before my boys were born, I would be gone, I would say at least 2/3, if not 3/4 of the year, I would be on the road. Now it's a half the year or a little bit less probably.
Is Baltimore the perfect city for you to live?
Well, I lived in New York for 20 years. After graduating from Curtis, I moved to New York, And I lived there, and New York is a great place for musicians. Every musician in the world either lives in New York or travels through New York. So you get to see them all, you get to rehearse, you get to play. But after Oliver was born, my younger son, they were bouncing off the walls in the little apartment, and there was nowhere to practice, and it just didn't make sense. We needed grandparents around, and so I moved back home to where I grew up. And what I found in Baltimore was an incredibly welcoming community. And Beth El was a big part of that. It really was. Eli was already old enough to be going to school, but preschool, Oliver went to preschool at Beth El, and both boys went to religious school. And just the number of people that were welcoming and embraced us, it was very different from living in New York. And we've stayed here and made a home. And we're happy that we're here.
It's interesting for a musician to know if you have other interests.
Sorry, guys. Could you, Evan, talk that like effect that you put on?
Oh, right.
Echoing.
Oh, right. Sorry. Now it's off. Thank you for reminding me. I had forgotten. Other interests, other hobbies. My grandfather, who was a great cellist, also spoke very wisely on many topics, and he spoke about hobbies. And he said how important it is to have hobbies. And he said the really important thing about a hobby is to know just enough about it to think that you're good. Because if you know a little bit too much, then you know as all the things that you don't know. But you need to have a hobby and imagine that you're pretty knowledgeable, you're pretty good at it. And so I, especially before the boys were born, I had a number of hobbies that I cared a lot about. Fly fishing was one of them. Now, fly fishing takes a lot of time and energy. And when Eli and Oliver were born, there wasn't that time anymore. So I really have hardly fished since Eli was born. But Oliver, my youngest, just went off to college. So maybe the fly rods are going to come back out. I don't know. We'll see. But I have other hobbies. I am a baker. I like to bake bread. And so traveling around the world, I used to always seek out the local bakeries and talk to the bakers and find out secrets. And at one point, my refrigerator was mostly filled with sourdough starters from all over the world. My wife has trimmed that collection. So now there's room for other food in the refrigerator, but I still bake bread pretty regularly.
So if you weren't a professional cellist, do you think you would have been a baker?
Definitely not.
What would your parents would like to see?
Being a baker would be a very difficult life. You have to be up at 3 in the morning. I'm very happy it's a hobby.
But if you weren't a cellist, what would your parents or you would like to see you doing if you weren't a professional cellist?
You know, people have asked me that question, but it's very hard to answer because the thought of not being a cellist, I'm very lucky. I get to do the thing that I love doing. But the thought of not being a cellist, it's hard for me to wrap my head around. And there isn't anything that I can say. I don't want to be a lawyer or a doctor or a banker or I think something creative I would probably want to do. But I just feel fortunate that I've gotten to do what I love doing.
And how does Joan, your wife, support your career as far as being so much out of the home? And
well, Joan studied and became a lawyer and was a very successful lawyer in Northern Virginia, in Fairfax. And she became a partner in a law firm there. And she was a partner there when we got married. And after we got married, she moved up to New York and she waved into the New York bar. And then very soon after that became pregnant with Eli. And then Eli was born. And the boys have been all consuming. And so she stopped practicing law at that point. And she's kept up her law license, both in Virginia and New York. But she has not practiced law since then. And she has kept the household going and taken care of the boys and allowed me to travel the world with my cello.
Your grandfather had some incident with the Israeli Philharmonic Orchestra, and my father, who is a cellist, rescued him. Can you share that story?
So he was playing a concerto with the orchestra that your father was principal cello in.
The Israeli Philharmonic.
Israeli Philharmonic. He was playing a concerto, and at some point in the middle of the work, his string broke. Now, if they actually had to just stop the whole piece and he had to go backstage and get a string and tune it, and it wouldn't stay in tune because it was a gut string, so he would have to tune it over and over again. Instead of that, he turned to your father and he traded cellos. He handed his cello and your father handed him a cello, and he finished playing the concert on your father's cello. Now, when an incident like that happens in a concert, of course, as a performer, you think, oh, what a catastrophe, but in fact, the reality of it is a little bit different. My grandfather was very profound about this. He believed that something like that happens in a concert, and that is the concert that the audience will never forget. He used to say, this one they'll remember. If it went perfectly, it's another concert, but the one where the string broke and they had to trade cellos, that one they remember.
And you played on that cello as well. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do. I do, because you had your father's cello, and so I played on it at Beth El.
Right. I have this cello here. I just want to show you a picture. Does this picture ring a bell?
Oh, yes.
So this picture is Evan's grandfather playing with the Israeli Philharmonic Orchestra, and it's autographed to my father. And I just wanted to share it with you, Evan, tonight.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love that.
Ladies and gentlemen, are there any questions from the floor to Evan? We can open now the interview for questions.
Beautiful. So the individual doesn't know if they missed it, but do you still play your grandfather's, and I'm not a musician, so I'm going to butcher this, the Stradivarius?
So I do. I'm very spoiled. I have two amazing cellos. One of them is my grandfather's Stradivarius, and the other is a cello that's 4 years older, made in 1721. Interestingly, by the same man who made that cello that was given to my grandfather, Montagnana. It's not the same instrument, but is made by the same maker. And the Montagnana I found when I lived in London. I didn't buy it then, I just met it. It was being played by a different cellist. And I re-met the cello in New York 10 years later, and it was for sale. And I fell in love with that cello. And I play on my Montagnana quite frequently. In fact, the one I played for you was the Montagnana.
Are there questions from the...
Yeah, so actually, simultaneously, I got the same question, basically. Are your sons musical?
So they both are musical. The younger one studied music. He started off with the violin, which didn't stick. And then he played the piano, and he played the piano nicely, but it wasn't going to be his thing. And then he started to sing. And so he sang in musicals, and eventually in choruses and a cappella groups, and he took voice lessons at Peabody, and he has a beautiful voice and is quite talented, but it's not what he wants to do. His passion is drawing and painting. And so it's the visual arts that attract him. And he's just started in college, and we're encouraging him to join an a cappella group just to keep it going and to have friends in that group. And we'll see if he does or not.
a hobby for him.
Yeah, the older one never took an instrument. He was very involved in sports. He was a swimmer, a very serious swimmer, and swam in college. And that takes up, anyone who knows swimming, that takes up a huge amount of time. And so that's a lot of what he did.
Yeah. Amy, I'll unmute you if you have a question. I actually meant to share this photo that you had sent us. So this is the boys and you and your wife. Obviously you just said the youngest one is off to college, right?
Yes, Oliver.
So much older, obviously now, but
Yeah, this is Eli's bar mitzvah.
amazing. So just to share that with you, all of you. And where did Amy go? Do you still have a question? Okay, I'll unmute you.
Thanks. Hi, Evan.
Hi.
In 1986, I ran the International Cello Congress with Janos Starker in Bloomington, Indiana. By any chance, were you there?
I was not in that one. I was at other cello congresses. There was one actually in Maryland and then one in St. Petersburg, and I attended those. But in 1986, where
June
was
of-
I? That's a good question.
They did Bolero with mass cello ensemble.
Yeah, they're fun when that many cellists get together. They have a lot of fun. And there's something about cellists. We're always friends. Violinists, maybe not so much, but cellists are always friends.
I have a question. You talked about how your parents met. How did your grandparents meet?
That's a wonderful story too. So my grandfather was touring a lot, and my grandmother lived in Paris, and my grandmother's family used to have musical evenings. So once my grandfather was well known, and he got invited by his friend Arthur Rubinstein to go to this family's house and have a chamber music evening. And there they met. And my grandfather was smitten, and he asked my grandmother, he said, can we do something? Can we go out? And my grandmother said, do you play golf? He said, of course I play golf. He had never played golf in his life. He had to borrow shoes that were 3 sizes too small, and he hobbled around the course after her. And then they dated for a little while, and he asked her, he said, would you come with me to the south of France for a weekend? And she thought that was very impertinent, and she said no. So he was hurt that she said no, and he said, I'm never going to speak to this woman again. That's it. And he packed up and he went off on tour, and a year passed. And he was back in Paris, and Arthur Rubinstein again said, would you come to this house? They're having chamber music. He said, absolutely not. I wouldn't do it. He put on his pajamas. He got into bed. He couldn't sleep. So he put his clothes on. He went to the house, and they fell completely in love, and they eloped. They got on a boat, went to America together, and were married by the Justice of the Peace in Kalamazoo, Michigan. An interesting addition to that story is, as an adult, I was performing in Florida, actually in a retirement community, and a woman in her 90s came up to me and said, you would not know who I am, but I was the witness at your grandparents' marriage. She was the next door neighbor of the Justice of the Peace, and she had been brought over, and she signed their marriage certificate. And I met her in Florida.
It's a wonderful story. Other questions from the floor? Any other questions?
There seems to be one more. Did your mother play an instrument?
My mother played the flute, but she took it up quite late in life. It's interesting, my grandfather did not encourage his children to play music. He felt as though, he used to say that his cello was his weapon against the world. And that was partially because of the difficulty of his childhood. He was abandoned by his father at one point in the middle of Russia at age, I think, 11, and had to make his way alone by himself, jumping on trains and walking for hundreds of miles to get back home. His father later had completely abandoned the family, and he had to support his entire family. And for much of the time they were starving. And for him, music was a difficult life. He spent his life alone in a hotel, in an airplane. It was not easy, and he wanted something better for his children. So he didn't encourage them, but my mother loved music. And so late in life, she took up the flute, and she played quite beautifully. In fact, as I was learning the cello, the two of us played together.
Ever think about writing a book about you and your family?
Maybe someday. I'm getting old enough. Maybe I should start.
I think you have plenty to share with the world about your grandfather, about your father, who was very famous doctor, and I know that he made bigger improvements in many people's life, especially musicians. Is that correct? Your father helped many musicians.
That is. My father was a neurologist, and his specialty was neuromuscular diseases. But for some reason, many musicians would come to him, and he helped a tremendous number of musicians. The contrabassoon player of the National Symphony came to him ready to quit music altogether because they no longer could. There was numbness in their hands, and person simply couldn't play anymore. My father always insisted that any musician having trouble bring their instrument to the hospital. So they played for him, and my father listened and said to this bassoon player, said, "When did you get that bassoon?" Told him, he said, "Well, when did the numbness start?" And of course, it was just around the same time. And so my father prescribed a key extension for the bassoon player and cured them of the problem they were having. He also, I don't know if any of you know the famous pianist Leon Fleischer, one of the greatest pianists that ever lived. And he lived in Baltimore. He taught at Peabody. And in his early 30s, his right hand developed basically writer's cramp, a sort of dystonia where his right hand would cramp up like that and he couldn't open it. And so he had to stop playing, and he played only left-hand works, and he conducted and he taught. And when he was about 80 years old, my father was able to fix his right hand by injecting the muscle with botulinum toxin and weakening the muscle enough so that it would uncramp. And in his 80s, Leon Fleischer's career took off, and he became the most sought-after pianist in the world. There's a wonderful documentary called Two Hands about Leon Fleischer. And my dad is in that movie because he was able to cure his right hand.
What a story. What a story. All right. So we're very close to the hour. I just want to ask you something. Would it be possible to play 3 minutes something by Bach, one of the suites?
I'm not really playing anything. I could, but I don't really have anything in my fingers now.
Okay.
I could play the beginning of the Selichot service to give people
Okay, please.
that if you'd like.
I would love to, and that will be a great culmination for our discussion for tonight.
I have an iPad on my music stand. It's the first time I've ever tried to use it. Many musicians are using these now, and I'm not at all sure I like it, but I'm giving it a try. So the Selichot service, now I should turn on original sound again. And then I'll just play a little bit, and then we will say goodbye for the evening.
Beautiful. Just turn off the double sounding.
There we go.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, what a wonderful evening. Evan, thank you so much for making this evening so special. Both your stories are amazing, your music, your tone, your sound. I think this was a great opening for the year. I know it was, and I want to thank Ellen for putting the program together for us and helping with the production. And I want to thank Becca Waltmeyer, for being our producer. I think that we need another evening like that. We should do a chapter number 2 sometimes in the near future. Ladies and gentlemen, have a great week. Thank you so much. Erev Tov, as we say, and April Shana Tova to everyone.
Good night, everyone. Thank
Good
you.
night. Thank you.